Hi, I'm Lisa Suarez, one of the co-chairs of the Vampire Studies area at the Popular Culture Association. Our 2020 conference in Philadelphia was unfortunately canceled due to the coronavirus. We had a wonderful topic, the legacies of Dracula. Our participants were going to visit the Rosenbach Museum to see Bram Stoker's working notes for the novel. So since we're not able to gather in Philadelphia, we are taking our conference online. And we had a very special morning planned at the conference with some of our fiction writers. And so today I have William Orem with us, who's going to be talking about his novel, Miss Lucy, and doing a little reading from the work. So William is right here. A little bit about him. He's an MFA and PhD. He is a multi-genre author. Has won some wonderful recognition and awards for his short stories and poetry. He's a 4-time nominee for the Pushcart Prize. He's also a playwright with plays staged both nationally and internationally. He is a senior writer in residence at Emerson College, and his website, williamorem.com, gives some great information about his works and his accomplishments. So we're here to talk about Miss Lucy, published in 2019 from Gival Press. It won the Gival Press Novel Award in 2019, and KIRKUS listed it as one of the best books of the year. And I really enjoyed reading Miss Lucy. Here we have a nod to Bram Stoker's Dracula. So maybe we can start with a question related to Bram Stoker. So this is a piece of historical fiction, and Bram Stoker comes to life on the page, and he does some things that are likable and some that, without spoilers, some people might raise their eyebrows at. Can you speak a little bit to this perspective you give us on Bram Stoker, maybe research, or how you balance history with your craft?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So somebody asked me how to describe this book, and I had to struggle for a while to figure out what the right term is. And the best one I could come up with is a fictionalized psychobiography, which sounds fancy, but it really gets at the heart of what this is. It's historical fiction using a number of actual historical characters. So it's imaginary in the sense that this is fiction. This is not a work of academic history, but it is a psychobiography in that I take the real history of the man and any number of other people like Henry Irving and Florence Balcom and Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman and Sheridan Le Fanu, all these actual people who were all intersecting in really interesting ways at the time when Bram Stoker was a young man. They're all in there, and they're all real people, and I kept their lives as close to reality that we know of from the history as I could, and then use that as a platform to imagine what was the psychobiography part, what would be going on inside the mind of Bram Stoker to cause him to develop into the kind of creative writer that he became later in life. So it's all reality up to the point that we know it. It has imagined interior realities. What is Bram thinking? How is he developing? What might his issues be? And then at a certain point, that just becomes a platform, and I allow myself to start adding in material that is actually just fictional, just for the purposes of art. Miss Lucy herself is an invention, but everything else that's happening around them is as close as I could keep it to reality. So research, I mean, just years of it. It's one of the things that came out of many years of loving the novel and doing research in Gothic literature and teaching the novel, and also working on a number of other projects about vampires and about Dracula. So yeah, lots of historical research, a number of books, a number of articles, a trip to, at least one, I think I may have taken 2 trips to Ireland. I went to Bram's the house in Clontarf where he was a child, to walk around and see what it's like there on Marino Crescent, and Dublin, and walking around places where he was there, and over to London to see what the Lyceum Theatre is like, and to Highgate, the famous cemetery where possibly Lucy Westenra was buried. Fans think she's there. Up to Whitby. I mean, all the Dracula places, to get a sense of what this world was like, and try and recreate it in as plausible a way as possible on the page.
Yeah, one piece I really loved about the novel is that very rich texture of the Victorian life, right? The Victorian backdrop. You brought the theater to life, and certainly with Bram Stoker's and Florence Stoker's home life. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, all those different
Thanks.
layers to the text.
Thanks. Yeah, a lot of that is imaginary because we know certain amounts of historical detail. We know that she used to be romanced by Oscar Wilde, for example, before she finally chose Bram, but we don't know, obviously, what their conversations would have been like, or what would have motivated her, or how he felt about that. One of the things that I enjoyed most on the idea of what's happening inside these people was looking at actual historical data about Bram's early childhood. Like, if I can hop back in time just for a second, the fact that he didn't walk until he was 7 years old. And we know this, and he mentions it in his personal reminiscences of Henry Irving, but we don't know why that happened exactly. And nobody can say what would the influence be on a developing mind of having been capacitated in this way until a fairly late age in early childhood. So that is, I mean, that's just gold for a fiction writer. I just love that possibility, and I imagined a situation in which he actually was not crippled at birth, but fell ill with a disease at a certain point, and what would the effect have been on his family life, and how would his father have felt about the son that he gave his name to suddenly looking like he was going to die very young. How does the son feel about the fact that his father is now regarding him as something that maybe he can't trust to live very long? All of that was great fun for me to write, putting myself into a Victorian world and into the minds of these historical people.
Well, we see Bram in a very vulnerable point in his life, right? With the setting up Miss Lucy. And he meets Miss Lucy. And again, no spoilers for those of you who have not yet had a chance to read it. But anyone who sees Dracula and Lucy, you think automatically of Lucy Westenra, right? You
Sure, of
mentioned,
course.
Lucy and her Highgate burial. Can you say a little bit about why Lucy Westenra? Like, why not Mina Harker or one of the other characters? What is it about Lucy that kind of drew this character to you?
So two things are going on here. One of them is part of the game of this book is asking the question of why did Bram Stoker, who was not a brilliant writer, he was not just this naturally effusively talented man like Oscar Wilde, for example. How did he come up with this one book, which is so interesting, and it's so much stronger than everything else that he wrote, and 120 years later, we're still so interested in this book. When I teach this to my students, I have to tell them, I teach Dracula every fall in a class on Gothic literature, and I have to say, in between this class and the last time I taught this class, there's at least one new production of this book, and it tends to be more, actually, depending on how you want to interpret all the different things Dracula has become. This is just an endlessly fascinating book. So how did that happen? That's one interesting question to me. And then the second interesting question is, when I teach Dracula, my students invariably are so much more interested in Lucy than they are in Mina, and they're even more interested in Lucy than they are in most other characters. She has a way of stealing the show. The book has this wonderful opening section with the castle. Everybody remembers that, Jonathan Harker trapped in the castle. And then you can break it roughly into the Lucy section and the Mina section. But the Lucy section has so much energy. If you just ask people, if you let them talk, rather than directing them, they want to talk about Lucy. If you ask them what they remember at the end of the semester, they talk about Lucy. when they dress up at Halloween, you know, the young women want to dress up as Lucy Westerner. They don't want to be Mina. And I think the book itself is much more interested in Lucy than it is in Mina. It spends a lot of time thinking about Mina, but the energy, the excitement really is about Lucy. And once we reach that scene where she gets staked, and the vampire Lucy is returned to the sweet, innocent Lucy, that's really like an energetic high point of the novel. And I think the book itself has a hard time trying to compete with that from that point forward. So here are two questions. Why is Lucy Westerner so much more interesting than she really needs to be? And a second question, how did Bram Stoker, how did he do that? Why did he write one book that's so much stronger than all his other books and that we're still so interested in? I find those interesting questions and I put them together and imagined, well, what if they're part of the same question? What if there was this other person who actually inspired the novel Dracula, and she has something to do with Lucy Westerner, and you've never heard of her because she wasn't the right kind of person. She wasn't the right class. She wasn't the right ethnicity. She wasn't the right background. She has just disappeared into history altogether. But she was part of what made this one artistic effort on Bram Stoker's behalf such an interesting one.
Yeah, could you speak a little more about this idea of the artist and inspiration? Because clearly, you know, the novel takes us in that very formative time in Bram's life when he's working for Henry Irving. And as you said, he's on the cusp of writing Dracula. And he seems to intersect with all these different artists that you've mentioned, from Henry Irving to his wife to Walt Whitman. And then there's, of course, Miss Lucy, who's, I mean, as you say, because of access, she's not there. She loves literature, she loves all these things, but she's the name, as you just said, that's sort of lost to history. Can you say a little more about how you see artistry and inspiration appearing in the novel?
Well, the book is about book writing in a way that is very intelligent, and maybe it even winds up being more insightful than it intends to be. There's an aspiration, and there's something very vampiric about this, the aspiration towards immortality through the creation of fine art. Henry Irving has the belief about himself from the beginning that he has attained artistic immortality. He's the great Henry Irving. He takes bow after bow. The crowds roar. He gives speeches. He takes more bows. He gives speeches. Ultimately, he's going to be buried in, I think, in Westminster. He's going to be knighted for his contribution. He is the artist who believes himself to be immortal. Bram wants to write something. He wants to be a writer. He has this love of Walt Whitman. He's so inspired by Walt Whitman. That's true, we know, and they sent letters back and forth. We have at least one of them, and I imagine some others. And but he doesn't, as I say, he doesn't have Oscar Wilde's power. He doesn't have Whitman's power, but he isn't Henry Irving, but he wants to find something in himself he wants to write a book that could last. It's true history that almost inadvertently he's going to come across it when he's ultimately able to write Dracula. As I say, here it is 120 years later, we're still talking about this book. And that's another wonderful moment if you ever teach Gothic literature. I ask my students, how many people here in this room have ever heard of Henry Irving? And unless you're a theater history person, right, or they're already studying the Victorian era, they have no idea who that is. And I say, okay, how many people have heard of Count Dracula? 100%. How many people have heard of Bram Stoker? 100%. I was at a D.H. Lawrence conference in Japan once, and somebody asked me to say something about Dracula. I thought, this is really interesting. I mean, all over the world, everybody knows Count Dracula. This is, in a sense, literary immortality. So Bram Stoker stumbled on it almost. Henry Irving thought that he had it, and it never would have crossed his mind that his amanuensis running around and selling the tickets and getting everything set up had created this character that was going to outlive all of them. So the book itself Bram Stoker's life at this time is very much about the creative pursuit of immortality, and the book itself is about creating a book and authorial power. And there's that vexed relationship inside Dracula between relationship between gender and authorial power. This is more a Mina question now than a Lucy question, because ultimately it's Mina is the one, as you know, who's assembling the book at the end and putting together all the pieces and making the novel Dracula. So I think Mina is very much the empowered female creator at the end of this. But in my version, I imagine, this is now Virginia Woolf's notion of Shakespeare's sister, I imagine that what if there was this other person, a woman who had all the power, and you never heard of her. She had more, creative force just naturally born to her than Bram himself, probably better, than Henry Irving. But you never heard anything that she had to say. And just for one moment in my imagination, Bram Stoker meets her, begins to act like an instructor towards her, and realizes, in an era where women weren't allowed to go to university and they couldn't own private property and they were just not given possibilities, he realizes this person has an excellent mind, maybe even a brilliant mind.
I love your reference to a wolf and Shakespeare's sister. That makes so much sense. I mean, such a moving image from a room of one's own. And I mean, Lucy is a character in your novel who is, I mean, she kind of breaks your heart. I mean, she's so rich. There's so many layers to her. And we see Bram being transfixed by this young woman. And I love especially the passage where she is in the Highgate Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was wonderfully written. So for the people who are watching this, do check out that passage. I love her in that setting. On the topic of Lucy and Highgate and art, do you have other nods to Dracula that you were really focused on in crafting Miss Lucy? Other pieces from the novel that you wanted to sort of incorporate or pay homage to?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So going through my novel, when you read Miss Lucy, knowing the novel Dracula, there are various nods, places where people in the know will recognize what the reference is. Bram with three ladies of the night in East London, like the Three Weird Sisters, or Jack Seward. You remember Jack Seward in Dracula when he's romancing Lucy, he keeps nervously playing with a scalpel, something that she comments on. So there's a reappearance of Dr. Seward and the scalpel that functions in a different way in my book. There are a number of moments like that. I think perhaps more what I would say is that there are, if you're interested in the history of Gothic literature, there are a number of steps that happen in the history of Gothic literature that are reproduced inside the book. So, for example, there's a scene where Bram is taking a boat across the Thames and it's very foggy, and he becomes like an image out of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And he actually thinks about a couple of lines from Mariner in that moment. I'm back in the Romantics now, there's a scene where he debates the ethical and literary merits of Frankenstein at Trinity when he's in college, which was a fun scene to write. We know that he had these kinds of debates at Trinity. I don't know that he ever talked about Frankenstein, but I imagined it, and then that comes in later in the book. So, or The Woman in White, Wilkie Collins's novel, there's when Miss Lucy first appears, she's an image of the woman in white, and she's referred to that way. So things like Mariner and Frankenstein and The Woman in Light and Carmilla, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla is commented on. These are all other works that fed into the stream that ultimately was going to become Dracula, and they each get a little tip of the pen as we go through.
It's wonderful. So, I mean, all these things kind of come together, right? We're all fans of vampire literature, Gothic literature, and so it's really wonderful to. I personally like the brides references in Miss Lucy. I was like, oh, there are the brides when you see Bram in those streets in East London. I was also really torn with the novel because Bram does some things that I feel very sympathetic towards him. He's at this juncture in his life. He does make some choices that are kind of hard as a reader. Can you say a little bit about that relationship with the character and that
Yeah,
tension?
I kind of have to guess what you're referring to without spoilers. And after the interview, I'd love to hear what you're referring to in particular. Um, I am, I mean, I'm sympathetic with him. At a certain point, he stops being the historical character about whom I actually, I don't have any personal knowledge of him, and he becomes what I have hypothesized and then imagined. What would the effect be of having been sick like that when you were a child? What might the effect on your family life have been, and then on your developmental psychology? I imagine him as somebody who was wounded by an absent father complex his whole life because of that childhood illness, and that's what made him vulnerable to Henry Irving's overwhelming surrogate father stand-in role, and that Irving took advantage of him in this way. Other people have commented on how Irving, with his hypnotic powers, overwhelming Bram Stoker, was very much like Count Dracula's relationship to Jonathan Harker. I think I'm sympathetic with him. I think he's afraid. I think he's badly hurt from his childhood wounding, and I think he turns to Irving in an attempt to heal that wound, and that's a mistake because Irving is vampirically using him for other reasons. And ultimately, I'm hesitating because I want to step around the plot. I don't want to give anything away, but he's going to have to decide whether he lives for Henry Irving or whether he lives for himself, and whether his artistry is about being like the great Henry Irving, or his artistry, as I have Walt Whitman arguing to him, has to be about being himself. Ethical decisions are going to have to be made that have to do with the fundamental question of who he is and how he sees himself with regard to Miss Lucy, but also with regard to the future. So whether he makes the right call or not, I can't say. I got to leave that to somebody else to read the plot. I think I would say that I'm sympathetic with him, although I don't know that I agree. I don't know that I would agree that, and he doesn't know either. I mean, there's a scene where he's accused by Lucy of a particular thing, and he says, "I've tried to be a good man. I've done the best I can," and he walks away. I don't know if you remember this, and the sound of the people walking around him sounds to him like mocking applause. Henry Irving is just met by roaring applause every night, and here's this slow, mocking applause for Bram Stoker, who can't even bring himself to make this very difficult moral decision. So I put him in as tough a spot as I could, and what he does there, I hope it gets to the heart. Whether we morally agree with it or not, I guess that's up to the reader.
Well, I really enjoyed reading the novel. It made me think in different, exciting new ways about Dracula and also about Bram Stoker, who we, as you had mentioned, people know the novel, but we kind of think about Bram Stoker as the author of Dracula, but you've given him his own space in Miss Lucy, which I really appreciated as a reader. So we'd love it if you would maybe read a passage from Miss Lucy for us.
Sure, be happy to. How much time do I have?
About 5 minutes.
I can give you just a little bit from the prologue.
Okay.
And yeah, I can probably just do about 5 minutes out of this. This will just give you a sense of some of the writing style. The prologue is written in a little bit more of a lyrical way than what comes after it. It's a reminiscence from his childhood, and it's infused with the kind of magical feeling that we have when recollecting childhood. The Pang of Famine, Dublin 1852 is the title. The Pang of Famine is a line out of Byron's poem Darkness. And it starts with the epigraph, "Arrive at the castle, loneliness, the kiss." This is from Stoker's draft notes, from the working notes that are in the Philadelphia Museum. We know that the scene that motivated him and that he kept returning to again and again when he was working on this book was the scene of Jonathan Harker and the three vampire women are coming towards him, and then the strong man emerges and drives them away and says, no, he belongs to me. The idea of the vampire's kiss, the idea of the castle, the idea of loneliness, I feel like it's a really suggestive phrase for him to have written down. Arrive the castle, loneliness, the kiss. The boy's name is Abraham, but we know him as Bram. Abraham suggests biblical strength, but this boy is not strong. Disease lies in him, unannounced. It has entered his body in cryptic fashion, showing as yet no sign. True, the delivery was troubled, and for a time he seemed dangerously weak. True, baptism had been delayed, but now his limbs are lean and sturdy, see, in a manner that promises a handsome adolescence. His features healthy, if severe, the round, pouty mouth, and especially the prominent forehead oddly assertive for one so young. It is the heyday of phrenology, and when adults pass him in Clontarf and surrounds, they take a second look, impressed by the capacities in that brow, though unsure of their direction. His father favors young Bram, who can answer already the responsorial prayer, showing a facility beyond that of his siblings. This child, the proud light in his father's eye says, this child. Abraham Stoker is a narrow, responsible gentleman who keeps large masses of hair on either side of his jaw, the peppery beard shaved underneath to his little knot of chin. With a parent's intuitive favoritism, he has named his second son after himself. Abraham and Abraham, pleased father of a fast-growing man. And how are we, my boy, this day in the morning? Bram basks in parental favor. How good it is to stand at the fire, the black grate warming your finger ends, to step only on the dyed parts of the parlor rug as if it were a bridge over a swiftly running stream, to run from behind the hallway door and throw oneself at father's calves and feel the warm, rough wool as his face laughs down. Now then, my little man. It has been a damp Irish autumn full of contrary gusts that smell like the sea. Tonight, they will do the prayer and response, a performance he and father have planned since Sunday last. Diligent, proud, Bram takes his chair by the smoldering peat. The odors of a dinner just enjoyed, cabbage and crabines, a hot black pudding with spices, festoon the waiting air. Abraham Sr. begins reading from the young worthy's book of prayer, but after a few turns, Bram finds himself choking. Mortified, he labors to pronounce, "Spirits kind to watch my sleep," but the syllables turn ugly. On the third try, his voice squeaks horribly in his throat. Tonight's audience, a mustache-laden barrister at Dublin Castle and his wife, are uncomfortable. It feels like blasphemy, this spasm in the child. Charlotte Stoker rises and makes excuses. It seems as if she will sweep her younger son physically up in her skirts. After all that she has experienced in the West Country, her empathy for suffering can be intense, even overwhelming. Following an embarrassing interlude, she rustles the boy upstairs to bed. Hot and cold rages the fever in his brow, his skin crawled across by invisible hands. When Charlotte snuffs the oil lamp, Bram presses his cheek, livid with shame, into the brocade covers. They smell of lye soap, of his mother's hair. Within the cover's darkness, he dreams a deeper black. Images as if from hell flood through his convulsing brain. A terrible carriage whose name is Disease is rattling madly across Ireland, hands and feet dangling from its sides. Its hunched driver cannot be seen, save for a leering, toothy grin. Bram fears the crook-backed driver, that black carriage hurrying closer on its insane race of destruction. All night, Bram struggles in the wild grip of meningeal fever. In the morning, he is paralyzed.
Thank you. And there the novel unfolds for us. Thank you very much for reading that passage and for talking with us about Miss Lucy. We're sorry we couldn't do all this, in person in Philadelphia. There will be a Boston 2021 Popular Culture Association conference where all of us vampire scholars will gather. But thank you very much, William. For those of you who would like to check out the book, williamorem.com, and Miss Lucy from Gival Press. Excellent.
I will see you guys in 2020. Thank you so much for the interview and for everything that you do for those of us who love vampires and love the Gothic this much.
Great. Thank you, William.